So I'll start off by introducing the Fatherhood Institute. The Institute is a charity founded in 1999, produces research summaries to disseminate knowledge and understanding about fathers and fatherhood, and also some original research. The Institute plays a key role in policy and is currently special advisor to the Women and Equality Select Committee, specifically on inquiry into fathers in the workplace, and Adrian's been working with them. And the Institute also plays a large role in practice by equipping practitioners in health, education and family services to engage better with fathers and father figures in father-friendly practice. And there's some direct work too with fathers, their children and partners. So hopefully you've learned a bit more about the Institute today. So our broader project is Fathers in the UK, what do we know, what do we need to know? And this is led by Adrian at the Fatherhood Institute. We're very pleased to have been funded by the Nuffield Foundation, and Tracy's here in the front. And I'd like at this stage also to thank our supervisory group, Professor Wendy Siegel, Svetlana Spate, Professor Margaret O'Brien and Professor Kath Kiernan, who were an excellent guide to us throughout the work, but all the interpretations are our own. Okay, so this project, Fathers in the UK, what do we know, what do we need to know? We've constructed a very large library of literature, research literature primarily, on UK fathers and fatherhood. And this has been done through systematic searches of bibliographic databases for UK studies, and also other search methods such as contacting experts and so on. So from this library, we've so far produced 2 research reviews on key fatherhood topics. The first is Cash or Carry, another good title here from Adrian. Fathers Combining Work and Care in the UK, and that was published about a month ago in December. And coming up later this year is Who's the Bloke in the Room? Fathers Antenatally and at the Birth. And we hope in the future to write further research reviews on the basis of our library and welcome approaches for collaborative work. So today I'm going to talk about the Datasets review, which is a review of large-scale longitudinal and cross-sectional datasets. And I'm pleased to tell you that online today at that web link are our executive summary here and what do we call it? Our condensed report. It's a summary report of about 35 pages, which is a good summary of what we've done. There's going to be a longer working paper put up hopefully next week, and it will be launched next week. So our research has taken place in the context of changing families and changing longitudinal studies. We know that there are fathers of dependent children in intact, separated and blended families, and of course there are many more fathers of adult children too. So we asked 2 research questions. How can birth, adoptive and social fathers and resident and non-resident fathers of dependent and adult children be identified and differentiated in large-scale data sets? And we've also asked the question, how is data about fathers collected? About fathers, and also importantly, how is data collected directly from fathers? By birth fathers, we mean biological fathers and also other fathers who are on birth certificates. And by social fathers, we mean stepfathers and foster fathers, and there are other categories of male guardians as well. We've using some new language and new terminology, which we'll come on to, and we've looked at less extensively researched categories. And maybe the most important thing to note, which I'll be talking about again in a minute, is that our understanding of a resident father means a father who's full-time or part-time co-resident with their child or children. It's also a time of changing longitudinal studies. The ESLC review of longitudinal studies is due to report this year, and I'm sure that everyone's wondering whether there might be a new cohort study or any other form of longitudinal study proposed. We know that CLOSA are very involved in collaborative work between datasets, including question harmonisation, and I guess that's also a development in the longitudinal datasets world. Our datasets review has looked at the questions asked and fieldwork practices in 16 large-scale UK datasets, 7 longitudinal studies, which I've named there, and 9 repeated cross-sectional datasets, all of which are research surveys, the census, plus birth registration statistics is the administrative data source we've looked at. So you'll see that a few of those are birth cohort studies or the longitudinal study of young people in England at UCL. For those of you who might be involved with the LSYPE, we didn't look at your most recent sweep of age 25. We were looking at previous sweeps there. And we looked at understanding society. So we've looked at published research instruments and fieldwork documentation. We know that there will be unpublished guidance for interviewers and so on as well. The idea has been to look for precedents that may be used in new longitudinal studies in the future and new sweeps of ongoing studies. And also some of what we found is relevant to larger repeated cross-sectional studies like the census and the labour force survey and so on to establish statistical time series, for example, for non-resident parents. We've created a new residence typology, so the work's involved some conceptual work too, and using some new language. As I've already said, resident means overnight stays regularly, full-time or part-time co-residence with the father and the child. So they may live together full-time in a household, or the father and child may live together part-time on a regular basis. We know that there are many families in which parents and children don't live full-time at one address. And Kiernan wrote in 2006, so it's already 12 years ago, there are revolving doors to family life with many parents and children living together only some of the time. And the census in 2011 did introduce questions on second addresses for the first time. So a proportion of resident fathers, as they're called in the literature, that's why we've put it in quotes, and non-resident fathers, as they're called in the literature, that's why we've put it in quotes, live with their children part-time on a regular basis or are temporarily away. And we think that using the dichotomy of resident or non-resident without consideration of part-time residence limits research questions. So this is our typology. Up there are the full-time resident fathers. So the part-time resident fathers are part-time resident and they're part-time non-resident, but we call them part-time resident following the lead actually of the Millennium Cohort Study, the MCS, which has analysed the part-time away fathers, our first category there of part-time resident fathers, and they're fathers who live 1 or 2 days at least in a child's household, but not full-time. And the Millennium Cohort Study called those part-time resident. We call them part-time away fathers. Some of them may be away during the week for work and other reasons, for example, as an example, and they may regard the child's household as their permanent home, their family home. Other men may be living part-time and cohabiting part-time in a household with, for example, a child's mother. So they're the part-time away fathers. There's also fathers of part-time away children. We haven't looked at those in too much detail, but obviously exist as well. Then what we have looked at are the overnight care fathers. Now they're fathers of children of 2 non-cohabiting parents, where the father is obviously one of the non-cohabiting parents, and the child stays regularly overnight with each of the parents, regularly meaning on a weekly or fortnightly cycle, more or less. So we know that most of these overnight care fathers who have a child staying with them overnight regularly, part-time, are minority overnight care fathers, where the child stays with them on average for the minority of the week. Common arrangement might be every other weekend. The equal overnight care fathers are a much smaller group, and we've used overnight to define this group, but other researchers have called it shared care or shared residence. And the majority overnight care fathers are those having their child to stay with them for most of the week, and they are really a subgroup of what a lot of people will call lone parent fathers or single parent fathers or lone fathers. We've also in our typology got the temporarily non-resident fathers, where this is longer term non-resident, long-term away fathers for work. They may be in an institution, in prison, they may be long-term away for all sorts of reasons, and fathers of long-term away children who again may be away for work or study or in an institution, so on. So when we put at the bottom other full-time non-resident fathers, we really do mean non-resident. We mean no regular overnight stays. That's what we mean by non-resident. I'm not going to dwell for too long on this slide, but when you get a copy, you can have a look at it in detail. But we've looked at full-time and part-time resident stepfathers, and we've also looked, unusually for the literature, at 2 groups of non-resident stepfathers. And I'll look at these ones now. So 2 categories that we've looked at, they are the former cohabiting partner of a birth or adoptive parent who previously lived with a child and maintains contact. Usually that relationship will have ended with the birth or adoptive parent, but it's possible that the partner and the parent could now live apart and still be partnered, for example. A second group of non-resident stepfathers are the current cohabiting partners of a non-resident birth or adoptive parent in contact. So you have a birth or adoptive parent in another place, and they have a partner that's not your birth parent, a new partner. So most of that second category will actually be stepmothers, non-resident stepmothers, because non-resident birth adoptive parents are generally fathers, and fathers are generally in opposite sex relationships. But there will be non-resident stepfathers in that group. And of course, that also applies to adult children. So adult children will have a birth adoptive parent living elsewhere, cohabiting with their partner who is your non-resident stepfather. I hope that makes sense. It takes a while to get your head around all these categories. So I'm not going to talk much about the cross-sectional research data sets today, but just a slide here looking at how the cross-sectional research data sets, they're down in the rows from British social attitudes down to the UK time use surveys at the bottom, differentiate the men in a household, in a sampled household, who are birth fathers, adoptive fathers, stepfathers or foster fathers. So I don't expect you to look at all the detail in this now, but you can see that there isn't that much differentiation going on. So the cross-sectional research data sets don't differentiate adequately or at all birth fathers, adoptive fathers and stepfathers. They're kind of all mixed together in different combinations. In contrast, now we're looking at the longitudinal studies and we're looking at the childhood sweeps. So in the cohort studies, we're looking at what we've called cohort children, the cohort members when they're children. And in understanding society, we're looking at the dependent children in the sample. And we're looking at whether they have a father and what kind of father that is. And here we're looking at the fathers in the study household with the cohort child or with the dependent child in understanding society. And you'll see that compared to the cross-sectional research data sets, the longitudinal studies have lots of ticks. That's all we want you to notice. You don't need to look at the detail, but there's lots of ticks. And that means that the longitudinal studies do well differentiate in the household, study household, birth fathers, adoptive fathers, stepfathers and foster fathers. Similarly, when you look at the adulthood sweeps of the longitudinal studies, so we're looking now at the NCDS, the British cohort study, AUSPAC, the longitudinal study of young people in England, and also understanding society for their adult sample members, you can see again, there's lots of ticks there on the left side of the table, which is looking at those men who are categorised as resident fathers. It differentiates well birth, adoptive, foster and step. So on the right-hand side of that table, you can see they've got two columns there for non-resident birth fathers and non-resident stepfathers. So again, in these adulthood suites, they do well. They identify the men amongst the cohort members or sample members who are non-resident birth fathers, but they more rarely do it to identify those who are non-resident stepfathers. You can see one tick there for the NCDS British Cohort Study Understanding Society right on the right. So here we're looking again at the longitudinal studies. We're looking at the cohort children now in the childhood suites and back at the young sample members, dependent children in understanding society. And you can see that they also identify quite well which of those children have a non-resident birth father, although not always accurately whether they're living birth father actually, but more on that in my report. But what they do rarely is identify where that dependent child has a non-resident stepfather. So Understanding Society does it for the non-resident stepfathers who are the current cohabiting partners of a non-resident birth or adoptive parent. So that's a non-resident stepfather that lives with your mum who's not living with you. And only the Millennium Cohort Study does it for the non-resident stepfathers who are the former cohabiting partners who moved out of the child's household. They previously were a resident stepfather with the cohort child, and the MCS does identify that group. So now, last table is for the residence categories, and we're looking here at the childhood sweeps again in the longitudinal studies and Understanding Society, at the dependent children again, and you'll see that only the Millennium Cohort Study identifies where a dependent child has a part-time away father. They're the fathers who are in the household for 1 or 2 days a week and moving out and into the household. And the most recent studies, growing up in Scotland, the Millennium Cohort Study and Understanding Society, show where a dependent child is in overnight care alternately with their non-cohabiting parents. So they have an overnight care father. So, as well as looking at how they differentiate, we've looked at the methodological reasons for this variation. I'm here to encourage you to look at our report because I can only give you a complete snapshot, the flavour of this now. So we've looked at who is counted in each household. And that's usually it's about defining what's the main residence of this individual. If they count the study household or the sampled household or the cohort child's household as their main residence, they're included in the household and categorised as residents. And there are published household inclusion rules which mainly relate to being temporarily away from the study household, but rarely are explicit about adults who are part-time resident in the study household. So they live there some of the time, on and off. And again, overnight care children, whether they're included in the study household, the latest longitudinal studies are starting to specify that, but not always adequately. Right, here are some identifying questions and more in our full report. For example, in the Millennium Cohort study, the latest sweeps to identify part-time away fathers. Can I check, does, and the name of the person, live here all of the time, or does he or she also live somewhere else? Understanding Society identifies overnight care fathers. About how many nights each week, fortnight or month does the child usually stay overnight with their mother or father during term time? And they also ask a similar question of the non-resident fathers in the Understanding Society sample, those categorised as non-resident. As long ago as 1975, the British cohort study were identifying long-term away fathers. List below any members of the family not included in the above table. For example, those who are only home for holidays and leave, and inquire or state from your own knowledge the reason for absence. And non-resident stepfathers at the bottom, the most recent sweeps of the NCDS, the National Child Development Study, and the British Cohort Study. Do you have any children who are not currently living in your household of whom you consider yourself to be a parent? They identify whether those children are a child of a current or a previous spouse or partner. Has that child ever lived with you? And they identify contact but not overnight stays. So I've really given you a flavour of our review on the identification and differentiation of fathers. We've also looked at how data is collected. Just to say for now that we are very pleased that our contribution to the ESRC review of longitudinal studies ended up in the consultation report there. So we said we propose that data collection from resident and non-resident fathers is a core part of birth and child cohort studies in order to adequately address the scientific priorities of the long-term effects of childhood experience and biotechnology revolution, the genetic contribution of biological fathers. And we can't take that for granted. Fathers have been included in some of the past longitudinal studies, but not always has the funding been there from the beginning. And we can't take that for granted in future studies. We have to keep making that case. And it's a given that it's difficult and costly to collect data from parents who don't live full-time with their children. And there's response bias as well, with men not identifying that they have non-resident children, not keeping in contact with fathers who move out of households and so on. But we think that our residence typology has a particular contribution to make to that in saying that surely we should be at least collecting data from those part-time resident overnight care fathers and also the most involved daytime care fathers, those that are with their children only during the day. And for equal overnight care children, who are a small group, I know, they're really two household children where there are part-time resident step-parents and step-siblings in two households. So it's a very quick run-through. You have to read our long, full working paper now. But if you haven't got quite so much time, or as a starting point, online today, we've got a very short executive summary and a report of about 30 pages there too. So thank you.